Now let's take some time to look at the different types of company. Now, first of all, companies can be either limited or unlimited. Now, when we're talking about that, we're talking about limited liability or unlimited liability. Now, we most commonly see limited liability companies. And as we've already seen, they can be limited by the issue of share capital, in which case the shareholder's liability to the company is limited to the nominal value of the shares. Or they can be limited by guarantee, which means that the guarantor's liability to the company is limited by the value of the guarantee that they've given. Now, the most famous company that I know of that's limited by guarantee is actually Network Rail, where the government are the guarantor of that company. Now, a guarantee company generally is non-profit making because it doesn't have any shares. It has no way to pay out a dividend. So what it will do instead is it will reinvest its profits, and that's what Network Rail is supposed to do. It's supposed to reinvest all its profits and use them to improve the rail network. Now, if you are a limited company, there are two types of company to think about. We have public companies and private companies. Now, the key difference there is that a public company, as it says further down the page, can offer its shares to the public. Now, we mean that by a public listing or a public share offering. A private company cannot do that. Now, it doesn't mean a public company has to be listed. A lot of public companies aren't listed at all. For instance, John Lewis plc is actually owned by its shareholders. It's owned by an employee benefit trust. It's not actually listed. But a private company has no choice. It cannot make a public listing. It can't be quoted on a stock exchange. A private company, however, could offer shares to a group of people. So, for instance, we might offer shares to first intuition students, and that would be acceptable, but we couldn't offer that to the wider public. Now, we'll look at the difference between public and private companies in more detail in a moment. Just first of all, let's have a look at unlimited companies. These are pretty rare. They don't happen very often. Why would you bother to set up a company if you haven't got the protection of unlimited liability? Well, they're used in very specialist situations. I know, for instance, I used to use them sometimes as part of my job in setting up private equity structures. The thing about an unlimited company, because the shareholders don't have the benefit of limited liability, then the reporting requirements and the regulatory requirements are much more lighter touch. Now, companies can change their status from limited to unlimited or unlimited to limited if they want to, and it's just worth knowing the rules there. Now, these rules are common sense if you think about it. If you are a shareholder in a limited company and your company was going to change from limited to unlimited so that you had unlimited liability, you'd want to have a say in that, wouldn't you? So to make that switch requires the consent of all shareholders. If you're going the other way, you're a shareholder in an unlimited company and it wants to become limited, that's still a big deal. You're changing the nature of the company. However, you personally are slightly less affected because as a shareholder in a limited company, you're probably slightly more protected than you were before. Well, not probably, you are slightly more protected than you were before. Therefore, not all of the shareholders need to agree, only 75%, because this is a special resolution. Now, it's probably worth just mentioning here, we will mention the different types of resolution and so on as we go through the notes, and I will remind you of the relevant percentages there. Later on in the notes, we will look at the operation of meetings and we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario with company law. We have to start somewhere, so there will be some things that perhaps aren't that clear to you first time through, but when you pull all the chapters together as part of your revision, hopefully will make perfect sense. Just a note there, although you can go from limited to unlimited, you cannot go from guarantee company to limited by shares or vice versa. That's not possible. Okay, so what's more important here is that we understand these differences between private and public companies. And these are set out on this table. This is a really important table. The subject matter in here lends itself very, very well to a multiple choice paper. So, and again, it's very easy to get someone to test you on this to make sure that you are able to deal with all these aspects. First of all, what you've got to remember is that the rules are generally stricter for a public company than they are for a private company. And the reason for that is that a public company is offering its shares to the public. Now, when you think about the public, think about little old granny and imagine that little old granny needs to be protected. And that will help you to remember the way this goes. So little old granny living near me in Bournemouth who's invested her hard-earned lifetime savings in a PLC, she needs to be looked after. Whereas your private company is owned by an entrepreneur, he's busily working away, building his business, slightly less regulation needed there. So the first rule is share capital. A public company must have what we call the authorised minimum share capital. Now that is set by the Secretary of State each year, but it hasn't changed for years and years and years. It's standing at £50,000. Okay, so you must have £50,000 worth of shares. So one thing the examiner might do quite often is ask you what would be a suitable business in the following scenario. And if he tells you that your two shareholders or your two key director shareholders are going to invest £5,000 each, a PLC is clearly not a suitable vehicle for them because they're not big enough. Now, for a private company, there's no minimum. You can have one 1p share if you like, doesn't matter. We've already mentioned that a PLC must have this thing called a trading certificate. Now, we sometimes call this a Section 761 certificate after the section of legislation that deals with it. And basically, this is a piece of paper that the company directors have submitted to the company registrar and said, you know, we've met the requirements. We have the right number of authorised share capital and we have the right amount of our share capital paid up. So they submit that and then they get a 761 certificate. A private company doesn't need that. As soon as a private company has its certificate of incorporation back from Companies House, it can start trading. Offers, we've already said a private company cannot offer its shares to the public. A PLC can. It's an obvious one, but the names are different. If you are a PLC, you must have that in your name, so you must use the words Public Limited Company or PLC. If you are a private company, you end with the word limited or LTD. Although there are some sort of Welsh equivalents for both of those, you're not going to be tested on those. You'll be glad to know. Now, what you might be tested on is this point here. Some companies, if they are for charitable purposes, the promotion of education, the promotion of science, don't need to use the word limited in their name. Now, I'm never really sure why that is, but it's just a quirky rule. And again, I've seen the examiner test that. Now, there are quite a number of rules to protect the capital that's invested in a company, and we'll look at those separately. But one point here is about loans. There are strict rules about loans that are made by a public company. They're stricter for the public company than they are for a private company. Again, we'll come back to those later. Directors, it's a simple point, but a PLC needs 2 directors. Again, think about making sure that the shareholders, the investors in that company are protected. The risk is reduced if you have 2 people responsible for the running of the company. A private company can just have 1. Similarly, company secretary, the person who's responsible for sort of the admin in connection with the running of the company, organising meetings, filing annual accounts and so on. A PLC must have 1. A private company doesn't need to. Meetings. A public company has to have an AGM, an annual general meeting. It has to summon its give notice to all its shareholders. They get a chance to have their views heard. They get a chance to ask questions. A private company doesn't have to do that. Accounts as well. The accounts for a public company are approved at that AGM, and there are time limits to when that AGM has to be held, and those accounts must be approved and filed with Companies House within 6 months. A private company has a longer period. Its accounts aren't approved by its shareholders, and the private company has 9 months to file those accounts. Again, little old granny, she needs a bit more prompt advice if there's something wrong with her company so she can take action. Whereas your private company, then, your shareholders are responsible for finding out what's going on themselves. PLC is not entitled to take advantage of those regulatory exemptions for small, medium-sized companies, even if it's a very small PLC. But we'll see later that can apply to a private company. If you appoint auditors, a PLC, those auditors must be reappointed each year, again at the AGM. But a private company, there is an assumption that the auditors will just be rolled forward each year, unless the shareholders say otherwise. Now, looking at share rights, well, preemption rights are something we'll look at later, but you can't exclude preemption rights permanently for a PLC, although you can for a private company. We'll see that later. Different rules for the payment for shares. Again, they're much stricter for a PLC. If a PLC issues shares, they must be 1/4 paid up. Now, that means that if you issue a £1 share, the shareholder must pay at least 25% of that 25% of that share price over to the company. The other 75 pence can be left outstanding as a call on capital. It's unpaid capital. There's also rules about valuing the consideration for shares, which we'll see later. In terms of things like reducing share capital or purchasing shares out of capital, again, things we're going to look at later, you'll see that the courts are much stricter in the case of a PLC. To reduce your share capital, you need court approval, and if you're a PLC. There are also more onerous publicity requirements, saying that a PLC must publish certain information on its website, must have more extensive directors' reports in the accounts. Again, private company, much less information is required. Now again, this table is important and it will really help you with your revision and your preparation for the multiple choice questions. However, you'll see we've glossed over quite a few topics there. That's because they relate to the matters that we're going to look at in more detail. Once you've done that, this summary table should be invaluable to you. Now, how might the examiner test this? Well, a question like this would be a good example. We've got Alex, Barry and Carol who've operated a partnership for 5 years in domestic carpets. The business is successful, they want to expand, they're going to open some more shops and they're going to need to get some investors. So they think they're going to set up a company because then they can invite the investors to subscribe for some shares that will give them more working capital. Now, what sort of company could be formed and which type of company is suitable for this business? Take a second and scribble down your thoughts and then we can compare them. Well, they could go for a limited company and they could be limited by shares or guarantee. If they're looking for investors, those investors are going to want to be paid a return on their investment. So a company that's limited by guarantee is unlikely to be suitable. So we wouldn't want that one. A company limited by shares sounds quite helpful. What about an unlimited company? Well, to be honest, nobody's going to set up an unlimited company unless they had a very good reason for doing so. If the examiner wanted you to go down this route, he'd give you some really big signposts to make sure that you went for that answer. So that's unlikely to be suitable. We might go for a PLC. However, there's no sign that we're looking to offer our shares to the public. And we don't really know how big they are, do we? It suggests, they're only a partnership, there's only 2 of them. They own 3 shops and a wholesale unit. Doesn't really sound likely that they are big enough to warrant being a PLC. Remember, they'd need that £50,000 minimum share capital. That's quite a big investment. Now, if I were advising these people which entity under the Companies Act would be better for them, I think my choice would be a limited company. Or possibly an LLP, which is something we haven't looked at yet. I hope you went for the same answer. Okay, so that is an explanation of the different types of company and the key differences between public and private companies. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and look at formation of a company and how that might be brought about.